going to the other person with your mindset more on what is achievable here of what I need. I don't need them to see my point of view. I need to change what's happening and get their buy-in to make some kind of change.
Welcome to Get Unstuck and On Target, the weekly podcast that offers senior leaders insights and strategies to not only lead with confidence and vision, but also to achieve groundbreaking results. I'm your host, Mike O'Neill. I coach top-level executives on the power of ethical leadership to forge teams to be as united as they are effective. In each episode, join me for insightful conversations with leaders just like you, providing practical advice to help you get unstuck and propel you and your company forward. Let's get started. Joining me is Rachel Alexandria. Rachel helps high performers with overwhelm, people-pleasing, and perfectionism and other secret messes I look forward to talking about. Rachel is a former psychotherapist who has turned somatic. She's written 3 books. The topics are ranging from planning for difficult conversations, taming the inner critic, and a manual for using emotional freedom technique or tapping for stress relief. That's something I know nothing about, so I'm sure we'll come back to that. She's also created a video series. She's recorded an album of meditations, and she and I have had a chance to speak prior to scheduling this, and I've asked her to speak to the idea of how can one go about caring without carrying. Rachel, welcome.
Thank you so much, Mike. I'm so glad to be here.
Yeah, I'm just listening to your voice. You have that very calming voice about you. What led you to go first into psychotherapy? What was that appeal?
Oh, boy. I had kind of wanted to pursue it in college, and I had this fear in my head, this stereotype. Do you remember the show Frasier?
I do.
Lilith Crane was,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if she was a psychoanalyst or a psychologist, but I had this fear that pursuing therapy was going to turn me into somebody who came across as cold and clinical, not realizing that you can do something, but do it in your own way. So years later, I was doing admin, just basically executive admin kind of work, which is fantastic, but not my heart song. And I was confronted by my husband at the time. And he said, you're not making great money and you don't care about what you do. Maybe you should do something that's different in one of or both of those realms. So I spent quite a bit of time just really getting honest with myself about what I felt most drawn to. And it was definitely to helping people not suffer when they don't need to. And so I went back to school again and got that master's, and I've been doing basically something like this ever since. It was 18 years ago.
One thing that struck me is you work with high performers, and high performers might come to that role through all sorts of things, but you kind of write that but high performers, they too experience overwhelm, perhaps people pleasing, but that perfectionism is what kind of caught my attention. Let's talk about high performers. I want to assume that many watching or listening right now would probably describe themselves as high performers. Let's start with the positive. What lends itself to people to become high performers?
Well, what lends people to, what pushes people to become that way is, if you're here asking a psychotherapist, I think if we want to talk about the positive, what's great about high performers is they're the people that you want on the team. They're the people who get the majority of stuff done. Mm-hmm. They tend to be creative. They tend to be more visionary. And they also know how to work when the rubber meets the road.
Mm-hmm.
They just see where the gaps are. They make sure the gaps are filled. Like they just get a lot more done than maybe the rest of people. What lends people to becoming high performers? From my background, I'm going to say a lot of times they were parentified children. They were the child in the family who saw that maybe the adults weren't, getting all their work done in some kind of fashion. They couldn't 100% trust the adults. And so they started picking up the slack.
Interesting. Now, there are lots of positives with being high performers, but we've already kind of hinted at what could be some things that high performers might experience. I just listed the three: overwhelm, people-pleasing, or perfectionism. Are those themes you see a lot in your work?
Oh, all the time. All the time. And, they kind of go together. If you're striving constantly for perfection, you probably never feel like anything is good enough. Or if you're always trying to please people, then you're outsourcing your validation to other people. Both of those are going to lead to overwhelm because they are never attainable. Perfection is never really attainable, and you can never really rest when you're people pleasing.
So we put a label on three things, but I love the way you described that. But perhaps other secret messes. I've never seen that expressed that way. I imagine it could be wide ranging, but I love this word secret. We think it's a secret? Is that?
It is. Usually people look at high performers from the outside and think, hey, man, they've got it all. They've got a job that's super important and successful and meaningful. They're making the great money. They probably have some kind of awesome family. Maybe they've got kids, or they've got a partnership or a marriage. Like, they dress well. From the outside, they appear to have it all together. And the secret mess is that, first of all, no one has it all together.
Right.
But also, anytime you put a lot of, like, the majority of your effort into something like career success, for example, other things will suffer. So the secret messes I see are, people feeling like secretly they're jerks, people feeling like they're not putting enough time and energy into their relationships, or they feel really lonely. A lot of people are lonely at the top. That's a really common phenomenon. I think even more, especially with women, because there are fewer women at the top. There are fewer organizations for that. I see people, feeling like they don't know how to ask for help, or they don't know how to get help that's actually helpful, because that's not what they've cultivated. If you've made a personality out of being good at stuff,
right,
you don't tend to have lots of really supportive, emotionally intelligent community around you.
You mentioned,
but you don't let them in.
You mentioned lonely at the top, and you point out that's particularly true for women at the top because there are perhaps fewer of them. Why is that? Why do we hear that expression? Why do we either see it or experience a greater sense of loneliness as our responsibilities grow?
Well, from what I hear from the clients I work with who are, CEOs, general counsels, that kind of thing, when they were earlier in their career, they had more peers. A lot of people develop their friendships from their coworkers. Mm-hmm. And when you start being the boss, it's just not the same. There is not a across the board, like, you can't meet people at the same level. If you're a level up in terms of authority and responsibility, you may like your employees or the people who work underneath you. You may get along super well, but you can't ever crack a certain amount of the facade. You just can't. You can't. It's not, for some people, it's not trustworthy, or you can't trust those people to keep your confidences because it's too complicated of a dynamic. And a lot of times when people are higher up like that, they also describe that people across the C-suite or other executives, they can't 100% trust in the same way that they can their coworkers when they were lower level. just because there's too much power, there's too many divided loyalties. Yeah, and a lot of times the higher up you are, the more your friends and your family don't really get it. Unless your dad was a CEO, he's not going to entirely get what it's like to be that. So there's a difference between the position. Like, I mean, if you think about, let's just say the president of the United States, you don't really want that guy to come and sit with you and cry about how hard it was to order the military to do something. Like, that makes you feel nervous,
Right.
as a just a civilian, right? So it has to be, you have to keep such a tight lid on so many of the ways that you feel or think about things, because most people can't handle it, or it's not the appropriate place to share.
Regular listeners know that this is an unscripted conversation. I'm an executive coach, and it sounds as if the type of clients I have may be similar to the clients that you support, but I'm very, very careful to stay in my lane. I'm not trained in the way that you were trained, and therefore, in no way do I describe my work with clients as anything likened to psychotherapy or anything along those lines. And I try to keep that line clearly established. I say that just to say that the nature of your work, you're dealing with very, these are people who are of considerable influence, people who have gained that for a variety of reasons, but something has happened. And you made allusion to the secret messes. Is there may be things going on that may be secret to others. It might even be secret to the person that we're kind of talking about. How do you go about when you're working with a client? In what ways do you help them uncover these things?
Well, by the time someone's coming to work with me, they usually know what the results are of their secret messes. You know, my house is a mess, or my relationship is a mess, or I never feel like I know what I'm doing at work, even though I'm in this high position, or I don't know how to keep a lid on my intense emotions. And so sometimes they spill out in a messy way. Like, they usually know. They usually know what the outward, like their inner experience of the messiness feels like. They feel out of control. They feel like they're, kind of tap dancing through fire, or spinning too many plates and one of them's going to fall, or maybe a couple of them have fallen. So that's not usually news to them. What's often something that I help them understand is like both where that's come from and also what they can do about it. A lot of times people are looking for something from the outside world to calm the storm inside. And that's not the place to start. I mean, yes, finding like a trusted person to help you work with it is a critical part. But once you have that, like, for example, validation. I was just talking to a CEO today about how he's having a struggle with one of his kind of people across the board, somebody else who's in, I think it's the COO. And I'm changing some things so it's not recognizable to anybody. Yeah. And on some level, he's getting really frustrated because he wants validation. He wants that person to understand how he's feeling and to get that mirrored back. We don't understand that all the time we're trying to do this. We're trying to get people to acknowledge and empathize with us. But when it's routinely a fraught conversation and you're not going to get that, you have to start with the internal validation. You have to start by seeing yourself. And then you can feel more calm when you really do that, when you really see yourself and say, yeah, self, I get it. You're right. This is true. This is what we're experiencing. This is what's happening. Excuse me. And then going to the other person with your mindset more on what is achievable here of what I need. I don't need them to see my point of view. I need to change what's happening and get their buy-in to make some kind of change, whether or not they understand my point of view.
Let's keep along that path. This is probably more on a personal dimension, and that is I introduce the expression caring without carrying.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I understand what you mean by that.
Mm-hmm.
Can you kind of walk us through that, please?
Sure. So because I've done this work for a long time, when I help people connect inwardly to see and validate themselves, a lot of times what comes up is inner critics. Now, all of us are sort of familiar with that voice inside that's like, hey, you're doing a bad job, you suck, blah, blah, blah. And over time, working with those inner critics with my clients, what I've come to see is there's often material in there inside of us that isn't from us. So, for example, your inner critic can be blended with, like, I'll just use me as an example. I used to think of myself as lazy. That was a critique I would throw at myself. My inner critic would throw at me. But when I really got into like examining what was happening, the laziness thing isn't from me. That's from my parents. That's my parents' assessment of me as a teenager, not wanting to do chores, which, what teenager does.
Right.
So it was a thing I had to kind of unblend. I was carrying something that didn't belong to me. And that happens with our inner criticism, but it also happens with for those of us listening who have a lot of empathy for people, who care about people, who when you see somebody having a struggle, you're kind of like, oh, you can feel that. We're sort of built to, in some ways, take in empathetically and absorb other people's emotions on some level. And whether you want to say that's mirror neurons in the brain or an energy thing, however you want to understand it. And like, even if you just think about, oh, my sister's having a really hard time and I'm having a harder day because she's having a hard time. And if she was suddenly to call and say, oh my God, it got all resolved, the scans came back clear, we're out of the woods, or we got the money, and you'd be like, you feel better because the thing you were carrying has been alleviated. Problem is, we're in a complex world where we see lots of people going through hardship all the time. People you know personally, people you see on the news. A lot of people are struggling all the time, and we don't understand that we're carrying these weights with us all the time. So one of the things I work with people to do is learn how to care, to not be a jerk and not be callous, like none of your suffering affects me. That's not what we're talking about. But to care, I care that that's happening to my sister, but I cannot have the burden on my shoulder as I go through every day. I have to find a place to set it down. I still care. If she calls me and says it's all fixed, I'll be like, oh, thank God. That's great. But it can't be a thing that weighs me down day in and day out.
I appreciate you kind of clarifying. One thing I enjoy is as I'm looking at your website, as you shared what you literally list as your leadership manifesto. Mm-hmm. And may I just read this?
Sure.
Lead and be loved. Listen to yourself first. Live your beliefs out loud. Speak up for what matters. Honor your commitments. Acknowledge greatness. Rest. Allow people to give to you. And let love reign. Mm-hmm. I love those. These type of things sometimes don't happen overnight. Have these expressions evolved over time, or is this something that has been with you for a long time?
I'm sitting here being like, oh, where on my website did you even find that? Because it's not a thing I have put forward that often for probably 5 or 6 years. I love the manifesto and I still believe in it. It came about, I honestly don't remember. That feels like a thing that was like I sat down and wrote it out. I mean, I did go to the Leadership Institute of Seattle for my master's program. It was very group dynamics and leadership focused, and spoke to everything that I felt as true. So I think it comes from there. Like, what are the qualities that I want to exude as a leader, that I want to see in other leaders, that I want to help people find within themselves? And it's, I use that manifesto as actually a self-assessment for folks who start work with me, because it helps them see where they scale themselves as being weaker. So allowing others to give to you. You might imagine for a lot of people pleasers and perfectionists and high performers, they're generally weak on that. And that leads to overwhelm.
This will be the easiest question that you have fielded because of what you do and how you do it. But reflect on a time where either you or a client got stuck. And what did it take to get unstuck?
I have so many examples. I want to think of a good one. So I'll use a client experience relatively recently. She was having a difficult time in her marriage and really not seeing how they could move forward because they have a fundamental differing point of view on something that's going on. And I am a big fan of the third way, the idea that when you get stuck, usually you're seeing it as I can't go forward and I can't go back, or I'm between a rock and a hard place. And what it takes to get out of that is usually tuning inward and bringing compassion. Like, I do a lot of what's called internal family systems, or parts work for short, which kind of helps people work with different aspects of their personality, the inner critics, the protectors, the inner children, that kind of stuff. And a lot of times I'll be like, okay, go in and connect with this part and, see what they need. And then we kind of do a check on how are you doing that right now? Like, what's the attitude you're bringing? And a lot of times when people start, they're like, I'm just kind of frustrated with this part. Like, get up, do the thing, whatever. And I'm like, yeah, how well does that work when someone outside of you is coming at you this way? Very poorly, right? You get truculent, you get stubborn, or you feel ashamed. So we have to start with compassion. Always have to start with self-compassion. This part is doing a thing for a reason. And it first wants to feel cared for and understood. So with my client and her stuckness in her relationship was like, first, we need to find the part of you that is terrified and find the part of you that is angry and bring a lot of compassionate listening to those parts so that they really feel heard. And then we'll see what happens.
I've heard it described in a variety of ways. You use self-compassion. Let's use your term. For those who struggle with that, at least initially, do you have any tips for us that helps us begin to move us in that direction?
Yeah, to some extent, I would say it's really hard to learn to emulate something or to be something that you have not experienced from someone else. So if you have experienced a lot of compassionate care from other people, then you might want to think about channeling that or bringing that person in your mind's eye with you when you connect with a part inside. But if you haven't, we only know how to do what we've been initiated into, not just taught, right? Like being taught something is receiving the intellectual information in your mind, but having the like vibrational, the somatic experience, like the nervous system experience, is not something you can get out of a book. So being with somebody who can help hold that space is really critical. Additionally, like if people want to try a tip, if you can bring that space, you just haven't known how to apply it, I recommend doing mirror work, like looking at yourself in the mirror and really just only looking in your eyes and trying to think about yourself as a young child. Seeing the young, because our eyes don't change. Our eyeballs are pretty much, I believe this is true, the same size when we're little kids as we are adults. So that is the thing in our face that doesn't change. If you can look in your own eyes and see the child in you and speak to that child compassionately, super, super helpful.
That's a great tip. We've had a far-ranging conversation thus far, but if you were to begin to look for what are those threads that tie it together and things that you want to make sure that our listeners have as takeaway, what comes to mind?
What comes to mind for me, like the takeaway I would like to share is probably a lot of what you're carrying emotionally, the way that you feel fatigued, probably a lot of it isn't yours. And if you can like find the place in you where things that are weighing on you aren't actually yours to resolve and set them down, even just temporarily, that will be incredibly relieving. And it's not your fault that you picked them up. That's, I think, the even broader message that I want to say to people all the time. The way that you are, sure, we make choices, but it's not your fault. You have picked up whatever habits that aren't working for you from society, from your family. Like you were just doing what you were taught. And if it's not serving you, it's not because you're bad at life. It's just stuff you've been taught, and it's stuff that you have to unlearn or pattern differently.
Anything else comes to mind you want to share?
I think I have so many things I could share. I don't want to overwhelm people. So what you're carrying may not be yours, and it's not your fault. I think that's good.
Very well said. Rachel, before we wrap up, I'd like to ask our listeners a question, and that is, do you ever wonder why people follow your lead? Is it out of obligation, or is it because they truly believe in your vision? With extensive experience in HR leadership and executive coaching, I've seen firsthand the essence of leadership. For me, it's clarity and confidence. It's about practical solutions that deliver bottom line results. With a tailored approach that's been somewhat informed by my Fortune 500 background, we're going to address those unique leadership challenges head on. So if you're ready to lead with impact, visit bench-builders.com. Let's unlock that leadership potential and make real strides towards your goals. So until we come back together, I want you to focus on leading in a way that truly inspires others to follow, not because they have to, but because they want to. Rachel, thank you so much for sharing your expertise. If listeners want to reach out and connect with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
You can find me at rachelalexandria.com. That's probably the easiest way. And I'm on Instagram too at Rachel R. Alexandria.
Now you're also on LinkedIn as well. Do you remember if it's this Rachel or Rachel R. Alexandria?
It's Rachel Alexandria on LinkedIn.
I have it open right here in front of me, but I couldn't see it with my faulty eyes on that. Thank you so much, Rachel.
Thank you so much for having me, Mike. It was a great chat.
I also want to thank our subscribers for joining us, and I hope you have picked up on some quick wins from Rachel. They'll help you get unstuck and on target. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Get Unstuck and On Target. I hope you've gained insights to help you lead with confidence and drive your organization forward. Remember, at Bench Builders, we're committed to your success, your leadership excellence, and your strategic growth. If you've enjoyed our conversation today, please leave a review, rate, and subscribe to keep up with our latest episodes. This show really grows when listeners like you share it with others. Who do you know who needs to hear what we talked about today? Until next time, I encourage you to stay focused on the target and continue to break new ground on your leadership path.